Hi. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay. I'm going to be very new school, like my daughters, and read off my phone. I hope that's okay. Yeah, I'm going to speak a little about the book, wherever that picture was. Yeah, whatever. But I'll be perfectly honest with you. I'll keep some of it to a minimum and just tell you it's a really good book. You should buy it. You should read it. Me talking about it is not going to help it get any better, but I will speak a little bit about it. I want to thank the Rancho Mirage Book Festival for having me here. It is very strange for me to be standing here in front of you because I'm not. I don't have the background of a man of letters, if you will, so it's a little weird to be up here. My parents were blue-collar immigrants, members of the working class, trying to raise 5 kids in a pretty rough neighborhood on the salaries of a shipping and receiving supervisor and a public school cafeteria worker. So I didn't come from an environment where many people read or even owned books. But my mother took me down the street one day and got me this little white card with a blue border. And they had me sign my name in my little 7-year-old scrawl, and I had my first library card. And so that's what I want to, just because we're standing in a library, and when I stand in a library, I feel like other people feel when they're standing in a church. I feel like I'm standing in hallowed ground. So I just want to say that I took out that book that day, and it might have been even been 2, and the world lost all of its limits. I could go through a book anywhere. I could go to outer space. I could go to the secret garden. I could sit under the giving tree. As I got older, I could go to Paris with the Three Musketeers. I could go to the San Francisco of Sam Spade. I could go to the England of Jane Austen or the Detroit of Elmore Leonard. I could travel the known universe and the unknown one. Without a library, books were a luxury in my family. We simply could not afford to spend money on something that would quite possibly only be used once. So without a library, there's no access to knowledge for me, to those worlds, to an expanding mind. Without a library, my path is pretty clear. Maybe I rise a little higher than the 35-year job my father had at Sears. Maybe I go to state college and become a lawyer and work in the city political machine my father so loved. Maybe, but with a library card, the sky became the limit. So I just want to say, once and for all, when you're thinking about, when you're writing your checks, charity at the end of the year, please think about libraries. Please think about supporting your local library and your public libraries. They can really change the world. So since we fell, I'll talk a little bit about this. I came up with this writer when I was very young. I started pretty young. It's suddenly strange to be old. But when I started, I published my first book. I was 29 years old. So. I remember there was this guy who tried to take me under his wing, and he was very much a salesman, and everything was about selling your book. And he would say, whenever you mention your book, make sure you hold it up. And I was like it's Palmolive? I don't quite understand. And he would say, yes, you hold it up and you repeat the title. So when I first came up with Since We Fell, picture this in my book, it is a book very much about stories and lies, which are sometimes the same thing and sometimes different. The main character, Rachel, is right from the start on a search to find out who her father is. She has a very difficult, very damaged and complex and extremely intelligent mother who refuses to tell her who her father is, even though she has that knowledge. Unfortunately, then the mother gets killed in a car crash on page 6, and the knowledge goes with her. So that becomes the early thrust of the book, is Rachel trying to find out what her paternity is, working on clues, and some of those clues are erroneous. So the only thing she remembers about her father is that his name was James, and it turns out that even that clue is incomplete. So it becomes a journey that she goes on to figure out who her father is, and at every turn, she's continually beset by lies and false narratives. And this will contribute to a mental breakdown that turns her into an agoraphobic. And the agoraphobia is the flaw that she carries through the rest of the book that allows the plot to really kick into high gear. So one day, when her husband is on a trip to London. Did I just kick out my mic? Nope. Okay. One day when her husband is on a trip to London, the one thing Rachel has is a happy marriage. She takes a spontaneous walk through Boston to fight her agoraphobia, and she sees a man who looks exactly like her husband exit a glass skyscraper, refracted multiple times in the mirrored panes, get into a car, and drive away. And that, again, becomes one of the impetuses of the book. When she reaches out to him, when she questions whether he could have been that guy, essentially says everybody has a double. And all the proof points to the fact that he was in London, not in Boston. But still there's this niggling doubt. And that's what drives the story. I was trying, usually when I write my books, I try to do some type of homage. I try to do something where I'm working with it. I've noticed that I work very well within a walled room because I get to move the walls. I don't work well without walls. So I like to give myself a wall, whether it's I'm going to write a historical, I'm going to write a Gothic, which was Shutter Island, I'm going to write a Greek tragedy, which was Mystic River. All of these things. I'm going to write a gangster novel, which was Live by Night. This was, I want to write a Hitchcock. I love Hitchcock. I think about Hitchcock all the time. Not the Hitchcock that a lot of people love, but I like the smaller ones like Shadow of a Doubt. But my favorite aspect of one famous Hitchcock movie is the opening 20 minutes of Psycho. And so that's what I was trying to do with the opening 80 pages of Since We Fell. Because the opening 20 minutes of Psycho have nothing to do with Norman Bates, a scary house on the hill, or anything. It has to do with a woman who steals money and her story. And then it all of a sudden takes this really bizarre turn. Just goes, and she gets killed in a shower. And you go, I thought I was watching a completely different movie. If it was 1960, that's what I try to project. If it was 1960, you were sitting in a movie theater, you went, wait a minute, that's not where this was supposed to go at all. And then she's dead. Now, wait a minute, she was our heroine. What happens now? So don't worry, I don't kill Rachel 80 pages into the book, but I did do something kind of drastic in terms of how I work the plot. And this becomes, if you even see what I just described, when she sees her husband walk out of a building, he walks out of a famous building in Boston called the Hancock Tower. The Hancock Tower was designed by A.M. Pei, and it's all glass panes, smoky blue glass panes. So she sees, not only does she see her husband in the rain, so she's not sure if she sees her husband because it's raining, she's seeing his reflection, and she's seeing multiple reflections. So she's seeing 10 versions of her husband in the rain walking out of a building. That becomes one of the symbols of the book, is that there's constant refraction, there's constant multiple reflections of a single person, often happening in this book, in which no one is remotely who they seem at first, which is a common theme in my work, because I think on the most banal and domestic levels, we are rarely as simple as we seem. And that is as true as if you just think of your first day on a job, your first day in anything. Have anyone ever noticed that the first person they ever meet, like in a job or in a new circumstance or whatever, is like 4 weeks later the last person you ever want to talk to? Like, you're like, oh, that guy was so nice to me my first day, and he was just great. And then the next time you see him, you're like, oh, Bob's coming, let's duck into the copy room. So anyway, my fascination with false narratives and lies and the ways in which they inform and embody storytelling began very early. And this is where I'm going to get into a little bit, leaving the idea of Since We Fell, which again, I hope I could pique your interest on it. I came to writing, again, not from a literary background. So how did I end up becoming a writer besides libraries? Well, one is I came from an enormous family. To put my family in perspective, my father had 17 brothers and sisters. Yeah, no, for real. He was the 16th of 18 kids. I don't know what his mother ever did besides have kids. I really have lost, I don't know. He would see, all he would remember about is he said she'd have headaches. I'm like, she didn't have headaches, she was hiding. You know, like, she said she'd go into the back room, we wouldn't see her for a day. I'm like, she was hiding. So my father's family was so enormous that the second oldest son and the youngest son never met, and they lived full lives. Yes, it's a true story. The youngest son by the time the youngest son was born, the second oldest son had left the farm, and he was like 18. He tipped off to America. Back then, you didn't just pop across over the pond, and that was it. He lived in America until his 50s, which was late age back then. And he never met the younger brother. The younger brother stayed in Ireland and then opened a pub. And then he committed the greatest sin in the history of my family. My dad, and some of his sisters and one of his brothers came back. And they visited that brother at his bar, and he charged them for a drink. Now, on one hand, you think that's a terrible thing. How could you charge your family for a drink? On the other hand, if you knew how much my dad and his sisters drank, it might have been an act of economic self-preservation. In either case, the second oldest brother heard that story, and he said, well, I don't want to meet that cheap bastard, and they never met. So my family would gather. They would do what a lot of immigrant cultures do, which is they would keep to themselves. So really, until I was 6, I don't think I ever really heard an American accent outside of maybe kindergarten. I heard Irish accents. I heard brogues. I just grew up in I would say I didn't grow up in 1980s Boston. I grew up in 1930s Ireland, pretty much, in an enclave. So all these immigrants got together and they gathered in the same place. One person found Dorchester, Massachusetts, and she reached out in a letter to her sister, and she came over, and she came over, and she came over. And then they all lived generally in the general region of Dorchester, Massachusetts, some over in South Boston, and a couple outliers in a place called Somerville. But here's what they would do. They would get together every weekend at each other's houses, and they would tell stories. And they would just rotate out in and every weekend. They would get together, and they would sit, and they would tell stories. Sometimes it was my house. Sometimes it was my Uncle Tom's. Sometimes it was my Aunt Bee's. Sometimes it was my Aunt Madge's. But they would sit, and me and my brother, my young brother with me, we were the youngest of 5, small family. We would sit and listen to them. And here's what was fascinating to me, and ultimately my brother. They would tell a story, and then about 6 weeks later, the same story would come back into rotation. But they would have tweaked it. They would have changed it. They were lying. And here's the thing. Me and my brother would be like, waiting, because far from anybody suddenly pointing out, Mike, you told that story 6 weeks ago, and the bicycle was a horse. No. They would all sit, and they would nod. They would go, oh, yes, I remember that. You're like, how could you remember that? It's a lie. He told a completely different story 6 weeks ago, and they'd be like, oh, yes, and it smelled good that day, too. I remember it was a fine summer day. And you'd be like, and so basically what was going on was this sort of collective either amnesia or collective brainwashing or collective addiction to lying. And what we understood gradually, me and my brother began to understand, was that my family had no respect for facts. Facts were that. Facts were like this. And it would be years, many years later, where I was in graduate school, and my teacher in graduate school, a great guy named John Dufresne, great novelist, he told me, he used the phrase, fiction writing is the lie that tells the truth. And then I got it. That storytelling is not concerned with facts, because facts, and particularly if you're an immigrant, in which there's usually an official version, and then there's the truth, the facts are interchangeable. Facts are made up by the people in power. Truth is something else. It's a very different thing. And so at a very early age, I realized that storytelling was a pursuit I didn't understand it consciously, but I knew it subconsciously, that storytelling was a pursuit of truth, not of facts, because facts change. Facts are temporal. So that didn't matter at the time. I just knew my parents were lying. The other thing, though, that I found very profound as I got older, and I didn't know this as a 9-year-old, I didn't know this as a 12-year-old, was that I think this constant telling and retelling of stories. My parents and their brothers and sisters-in-laws and brothers-in-laws never told stories about America. Never. All the stories were about the old country. All the stories were about back then. Time had stopped. It was like the moment they crossed the sea, a clock was smashed, and everything stayed frozen. And they would also talk very much in ridiculous terms. What we discovered were ridiculous terms about Ireland. because they would say, "Oh, in Ireland that wouldn't happen." Anything went wrong. Anything seemed amoral. Anything seemed too modern. They'd be like, "People don't get divorced in Ireland. People don't have affairs in Ireland." We went back to Ireland when I was 10 years old. I was like, "Who are you?" And they'd be like, "I'm your cousin." "Well, I never heard of you before." "Well, I was born out of wedlock." Like, and everybody was cool with it. They were all fine, Ireland was so much more liberal than the Ireland my parents left, but what they carried into the New World was a fixed Ireland that then they lived. And so their world was far more conservative and unyielding than the Ireland they left behind, which was continually changing. The other reason I think they were telling these stories was to make sense of the diaspora. They were trying to come to terms with who they were if they had left the home that they loved. Who does that make you? And I think that is always a kind of a private shame of the immigrant, because the immigrant always loves the homeland. The immigrant always takes all of their good qualities from their homeland, and yet they abandoned their homeland for self-preservation. And so it's a strange paradox to be living with the rest of your life. So that's why they kept telling those stories over and over and over again, to get closer to a truth about why they left and what that meant and who that meant they were as people. That's what I understood. Again, at the time, I didn't understand any of that. I was just like, man, they lie all the time. Another thing that I found out about storytelling that was fascinating to me from where I grew up was my father, in another fiction, would take me to a farmer's market. He would go to the farmer's market every Saturday in my neighborhood, and he would always tell my mother it took him 2 hours. Now, my father grew up on a farm. So my father's ability to pick out a bad potato or a bad tomato from 100 yards out was pretty legendary. I mean, he just had no problem with it. But for some reason, it took him 2 hours at the farmer's market. The truth was, it took him 10 minutes. It took him 10 minutes. He would throw all the stuff at me and be like, "There you go, grab the potatoes, put the beans in the back." And we'd throw it all in the trunk, and we'd drive up Dorchester Avenue, and we'd go to a bar on a Saturday afternoon. To this day, one of my favorite smells in the world, this is going to be crazy to say it, but one of my favorite smells in the world is to be in a bar on one of the first warm days of spring and to smell it coming through a door. And it's just a very vivid memory for me when I was a kid. My father would perch me on a bar stool. It would be like late April, early May, and they would open the door for that first time, and you would smell the smells of the outdoors coming into the bar. But anyway, I would sit up on this bar stool, and I would order a ginger ale, no ice, with a red stir because it looked like what everybody else was drinking. And I would drink my ginger ale, and I would listen to people tell stories. And that's what they would do. That's what they do in a bar. And these were more Irish-American stories. But I learned very quickly what the rules were. Again, I soaked this up. I didn't understand it consciously at the time. I was 12, I was 13. But what I understood and what I learned was, in the first place, was you start a story immediately. You don't wander into it. Nobody allows wandering at a bar. They're like, no, get to it. So get to the point quick. Get into the story. Number two, the story should probably be funny. Because, number three, the story, if it's true, is probably going to be sad. Because working class stories are essentially sad stories, because if they weren't sad stories, you wouldn't be working class. So the point being, if you tell too many stories in which you win, they're inauthentic. So that's the final rule, was the story had to be true. It had to be not necessarily factual, but it had to be true. You couldn't beat the man every time. The story could be, they took it to me, I lost. And then there'd be a small, minor working class victory, but then a couple of weeks later, I keyed his car, be like that. But yes, storytelling was storytelling as a type of blood sport, and I really responded to that. And when I first started writing, I felt that. When I started writing, this is very strange to admit for a guy who wrote a 700-page novel, but I was a minimalist short story writer. The first 2 years I was in college, I never wrote a short story that was over 10 pages, and that was long for me. It was like 10. Whew, that's crazy. Most of my short stories were like 7. And I think it was because of this feeling of, I just got to get in there fast. I got to get right in there. I got to get right to the point, or they're going to shout me down and tell the bartender to turn the game back on, because that's what would always happen. Um, I think that as a kid, I also I loved narrative. I think that that was a big thing. I grew up in a world that I don't think was built for um, the type of sensitive kid who becomes an artist of any sort. And so all around me was, I grew up in an extremely violent neighborhood during an exceptionally violent time, which was the forced desegregation of the Boston public schools. And so I think I was just kind of always looking around like, duck. And by ducking, I would just go and I would read. I would read and read and read. Now, there's only one thing, by the way, that reading gets you in Dorchester, Massachusetts. It gets your ass beaten to the ground. It's not like you're running around telling people. It's not like you're running up to your buddies saying, hey, come read Graham Greene with me. No. No. You're like, okay, let's play hockey. So I was very early on, I think, living two lives as well. But I loved narrative. I loved story. I loved anything that made sense of chaos, which is what I believe story is. Story is essentially, it's artificial. That's where art comes from. The base of the word is art, and art is fake. And so what a story does is it gives a patina of meaning to potentially completely unrelated, random, and chaotic events. But when we tell it as a story, they connect. We say A happened, so B could happen, plus C equals D, and this is why I'm here the way I am now. As opposed to what it possibly is, and what scares us at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is there's no connection at all. You're just walking around, and then boom, you get hit by lightning, you're dead, and that's it. Out we go. Well, that's a crappy story. Nobody's going to want to read that. So I fell in love very early with the power of narrative, with making a sort of a connection between the random. I think that all people are in love with narrative, and I think cultures are in love with narrative. And then I think ultimately the dark side of that is we can lead to national myths, which can be very dangerous. But otherwise, I'm for it because it's how I make my money. So another thing that, anybody here from Boston? Anybody know Boston at all? I used to live there? Okay. All right. Well, let me just explain another reason. Bostonians, if my family was a little odd, maybe because Bostonians are so Irish-based, if my family had an interesting relationship with the truth, Bostonians have an interesting relationship with the truth in general. I can say this because I'm a Bostonian. Otherwise, you could get killed for saying this. But the truth is, I think Bostonians are all just a tiny bit nuts. I do. I think we're all just a couple of cards short of a full deck, if you will. We're just a little off. We're a strange place, and we're just a little off. I don't know exactly why this is, but I do know that there's no place like it, and that's one of the reasons I love it so, and I write about it, because there's no place like it that I've ever found. Tom Wolfe has a great line where he says, in America, increasingly, the only way you can tell you've gone into a new town is by the next 7-Eleven. That's not true in Boston. Boston is just odd and strange and crazy. I always bring up the moment with the Boston Marathon bombing. When the Boston Marathon bombing happened, one of the first things that ever happened, and is continued to this day, is nobody in Boston will call these guys terrorists. Nobody. Because to call them terrorists gives them a type of stature that we just don't feel they deserve. So they're usually called knuckleheads. They just say, oh yeah, those two knuckleheads who blew up the marathon. I want those idiots. That's where they keep it. It keeps it nice and simple. A meme went out that night. It was the first time my daughter had ever seen me cry, because it happened right in front of a building in which I was a trustee. I was a trustee of the Boston Public Library main branch, and it happened right in front of the main branch, and it happened within 2 blocks from where my father worked for 35 years. So it was very particular to me. And I was sitting there, and I was holding my daughter, and then I got this little meme. I needed something to cheer me up, and I got this meme. It pops up on my phone. I open it up, and it's a picture of Kenmore Square, which is a few blocks from where the bombing happened. And it said, we're not terrorized. We're just wicked pissed. And I thought, that's Boston. That's Boston, like right there. That's it. We're not terrorized. We're just wicked pissed. I was trying to explain. There have been few times in my life where I feel like I've lost the voice of Boston, which is to me the greatest thing. My greatest pride is that I feel like I have the voice that you read in Mystic River, for example, or The Drop, is very much the voice of Boston. It's very much the inner city voice of Boston. I was writing in a specific voice. I was writing in a guy who's sitting beside you at a bar and wants to tell you a story. That was the voice that I tried to adopt. And it's a very specific Boston voice. And a couple of times in my career, I've lost it. The first time I was in graduate school, I went to graduate school in Florida. There is no place less like Boston than Florida. It is just no place less like it. So I had been there, and I'd been there a while. I'd been there 6 years at that point. And all of a sudden, I thought, oh, my God, I've lost it. I don't have it. Something is off here. I'm hearing Florida voice. I'm not hearing Boston voice. I can't do it anymore. And I went back home like 2 weeks later, and I ran into this friend of mine, and he had been kind of a brawler back in the day. And I said, how's everything going? And he said, it's good, except I got stabbed recently. And I thought, and I said, no, what happened? And he said, well, I was at Sean's in Faneuil Hall, and I got in a beef with this guy. And anyway, I hit him, and he stabbed me. And he goes, I don't know what you've heard, but getting stabbed kind of takes the fight out of a guy. And I thought, that's it. Ding! It was all back. Because I want you to just parse the insanity of that sentence. It's the beautiful phrase, I don't know what you've heard. As if you may be under the impression that being stabbed is kind of like a hot rock massage, right? I don't know what you've heard. And then the gross understatement. We pride ourselves on understatement in Boston. It kind of takes the fight out of a guy. Not I was pleading for my God, not it burns like, hellfire. No, it kind of takes the fight out of a guy. So I thought, oh, it's back. Years later, I was traveling a lot. I reached a certain level of success. I met somebody. They were in Florida. So going back and forth. And I was, again, kind of feeling like maybe slightly worried I was losing it. And my daughter was just learning to walk. And we were living in this section of the city called Charlestown, which is my favorite place in all of Boston. It's God's country to me. It's I would live there tomorrow in a heartbeat, but I'm in LA. But anyway, and Charlestown has two types of people now. It's really yuppified, and then it's what's known as townies. All right, and the townies are pretty hardcore, and they're mostly descended from bank robbers. It's true. It's true. Like and for years, if you jump a bank teller, if you jump the bank counter in Boston to rob a bank, they called it the Charlestown Hop. And any time a bank was robbed anywhere in the greater Boston area, the Boston Police Department, as a matter of course, put a police unit to sit at the only highway exit into Charlestown, and they caught half of the people that way. They were just going home. I was heading back to Mars. So Charlestown's just got this interesting history, but it became really yuppified in the 90s, and then in the 2000s, I lived there first in the mid-90s when it was yuppifying, and that's what inspired Mystic River. And then I went back there, and I lived there after I got married, and I had a little baby. And my wife said at the time, she said, I don't know what you're talking about with townies. We'd just seen the movie The Town. She said, I don't know what you guys, which is about Charlestown. And she said, I don't know what you guys are talking about because all I see are people, yuppies like us, driving BMWs and Range Rovers. And I said, just wait. And then one day we walked into this playground with my daughter. Again, she had just started walking, and we saw this woman, and she was sitting there. She was clearly a townie. She had this hair that had gone through like 15 different dye jobs and was that kind of non-color that hair gets when you bend it too many dye jobs. And she had a Benson & Hedges Deluxe Ultralight the size of a Scud missile hanging out of her mouth. And she had 3 kids clearly from 3 different dads. And she was sitting there watching them, and we sat down beside her. And my daughter was kind of trying to, again, she's a little spongy. She was like literally about a year old at this point. She's walking. And one of this woman's kids is buzzing around her in this car. And this woman's talking to us. And she's like, so you said Toonies. And my wife has no idea what she's saying. It's like she could have been speaking Czech. And she has no idea. And she's looking at me, and I'm speaking it back and forth to her fine because I know what she's saying. And then all of a sudden, she grabs this. She reaches out. This kid is buzzing around my daughter. She grabs this plastic cart, and she says to this little kid, she says, look, I've warned you. You're scaring that little girl. You're scaring that little girl. You do it one more time, I swear to God, I'm dragging you back to the playground and the friggin' projects. We'll see how you like it if you get shot. My wife was from small town New York. She's like, so we're going to go. And the woman goes, I'll never forget this, with the big cigarette in her hand. She goes, God bless. So that's the voice I try to capture. That's the voice I'm trying to after in most of my books, although it's not the voice that's in Since We Fell, because Since We Fell is my first book that's actually about people who are doing a little better financially than most. It's my first non-working class book. So I just figured I'd give them one, because mostly in Hitchcock movies, they're not working class. They're sleek and they're cool. They look like Kim Novak and Jimmy Stewart, and they're tooling around San Francisco in cool cars. So that was my Hitchcock thing. I will say, to put the final perspective on this whole thing that was my family, for all of their lying and storytelling, my father was a master storyteller. My father still, to this day, well, until he passed away, had never read one of my books. Never read one of my books, because he didn't read books. He didn't read books. He didn't like fiction. It was bizarre. He liked to tell stories all day and night, but then when he came home, he'd turn on the TV. He'd just want to watch 60 Minutes or read the paper. He just never got this whole thing that I did. He would tell people. He'd be like, oh, that Mystic River, that was a good one. And I'd be like, read it. And people would say to me, oh, that's kind of sad. And I'd be like, no, my father doesn't read. And then I finally, one day, I think I got all sensitive, and I went to my dad, and I said, it'd be nice if you read one of my books one of these days. And he says, he said, what does your brother Thomas do? And I said, he works in a prison. And he goes, you don't see me visiting him at work. And like, fair enough. So, but this gene, this strange storytelling gene, did get passed on. I'll wrap it up. I'll take some questions, but it did get passed on to me. And there are other storytellers in the family, and there are in the extended family, because there was 18 of them. When people would talk about the curse of the Kennedys, I'd just go, "There's no curse. There's 12 of them." When I'm from a family of 18 uncles and aunts. They didn't all make it. You know what I mean? It's just numbers. So when we had this large family, and we have some artists in it, and we have some painters, and we have some writers, and the gene goes through. My father, who thinks he's not a storyteller or not into fiction, passes it on to me. Now I have two daughters. My oldest daughter is already a storyteller. She tells great stories. Her friends are always asking her to tell stories. She's way ahead in her little classes in school. I knew this because when she was really little, when she was like 4, she had asked one night. She said, "Daddy, can I stay up and watch one more show?" And she was watching this TV show called Sophia the First. And I said, "No." And Sophia's a princess. And I said, "No, sweetie, you got to go to bed." "Oh, come on, please. No, you can't. Please. I'll never ask for another TV show again. Please. No, you can't." So I get her to bed. And the next morning, my other daughter, who was still in diapers, wakes up, and I got to go change her diaper. And Gianna, my eldest, my 4-year-old at that time, says, Dad, she wakes up, and she's like, "Daddy, can I come help you with Secure?" And I was like, "Sure." And so we go in, and Gianna at that age was into pulling books out and reading. I'd find her reading to the dogs all the time. Books would be upside down half the time, but she'd be like reading to the dogs, and the dogs would be really attentive, they do. And so I'm standing there, and she said, "How can I help?" And I'm changing her sister's diaper, and I said, "Well, why don't you get a book and read to Kira?" And she says, "Okay, that was my idea, Daddy." Okay. So she goes, she grabs a book. I didn't even know what it was. She opens it up, and she stands over her sister, and she says, "Kira, once upon a time, there was a princess. She lived in a magical kingdom, and her daddy said she couldn't have any TV at all." And she said, "You're not in control of me. I'm the new queen." And he said, "Okay." And she got TV. The end. So that's it. There's the gene. I'm very good at Q&A. We have a lot of fun with it. So let me take some questions with you guys. Let's have, sir.
Why did you kill Joe Coughlin?
Well, that gentleman just gave a spoiler to the end of a trilogy. Oh, sir. I'll talk to you privately. No, well, it's over now. I will say this. I tried not to, and the book turned out to be false. And no matter how many times I worked that book, whose title I shall not say, no matter how many times I worked that book and worked that book and worked that book, I have this weird thing. I can't release my books until something tells me I can, which is one of the reasons I don't produce nearly as much as a lot of other writers. And I just wouldn't release that book. And everybody knew it was done. Everybody knew the story was done. And I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. Finally, I was talking to an idol of mine. I was talking to the writer Tim O'Brien, who wrote The Things They Carry. And he was telling me how much he liked my work, which was getting me all choked up. And he said, the thing I like about your work is it's always organically true, which is to say it's always true to the heart of the material, not necessarily to what I want. And I went, that's it. That's why the book doesn't work. He's got to die. And I went back and I killed him, and all of a sudden I was like, the book works. Now it's a good book. Until then, it was inauthentic. It was artificial. It was fake. It was me not wanting to kill the character because I was like, oh, I really like him, and he's kind of my alter ego, and I've spent 10 years with him. Now he's got to go. So there you go. Yes, miss.
How did music fit into your family life in terms of storytelling?
Music, well, no, my father would listen. I think, again, these are osmosis issues. My father would listen to Irish music every weekend. He would listen to the Irish Hour, which I would point out to him was actually 12 hours. And, now, coming up now, Tommy Makem and the Clancy Brothers on the Irish Hour, and he would listen to this thing all day long, all day on Saturdays. And I grew up hating Irish music because of it. But Irish music is very similar to country music in that it's these tragic stories about ditches and dead dogs and oppression and under the yoke of the British, and there's nothing good, but everybody's really happy as they're singing them. So I think that sense of storytelling once again sank into me, and I just probably emulated it in a million different ways. But music to me was I was into punk rock by the time I was 12, and so they didn't understand what I was listening to at all, and I didn't understand what they were listening to. Yes, miss.
You talk a lot about your father. What about your mom?
Oh, my mom. My mom was great, but my mom was very quiet. My father was big and gregarious, and his family was all big and gregarious, and they were all lunatics. My mother was very reserved, very smart. She was extremely smart. And in some ways, I always found her a tragic figure because I think she was way ahead of her time, that if she was born even 30 years later in the right country, she would have been a doctor. She was so smart. I mean, she was Irish. And then the other thing was, we always were like, Mom seems to be, we knew my father was poor. We knew they were both poor. But then we went over to Ireland and we were like, wow, Dad's poor because there was 18 of them. Right? That's simple. It's simple math. But they grew up in a very prosperous farm. They were very much part of a big community. I mean, then we went to my mother's house and we were like, they're just dirt poor. There's no number of, there were two of them, they would have been dirt poor. It was staggering levels of poverty. And it really made me understand my mother. It was gray and they didn't have when we went there when I was 11, and my grandmother, who was 96, she had never used a toilet. So you got to remember that Ireland until the Irish Tiger was about a half a century back. So it was, I think my mother was in many ways, again, I find her a very tragic figure. I don't think she would have ever had kids. I think her career was enough. She would talk with just rap. The only time you would see her truly come alive was when she talked about working for the USO and being single in New York in the late 40s. And she would talk about walking to the music clubs that used to dot around the edges of Central Park. And she would talk about crossing the park. You could cross the park at night. And she was like, it was a wonderful world. And she would just talk about going to clubs. A woman who never drank a drink of alcohol in her life. But she was just, oh yeah, hell yeah. He was made up for everything. They made up for everything. And then that side of the family, my mother's side of the family, was extremely reserved, extremely intelligent, but very, very funny. That was the weird thing. They were funny in a very quiet way. They could just say, you'd be like, deadpan humor, very quiet. Where my father's, they were laughing and uproarious and singing the same song. So it was a very interesting combination, and certainly produced exactly the type of combination that would produce writers and entertainers, I think. So, yes, miss. What have I thought about the screen adaptations of my books? I think they're good. It's the only way I can put it. I can't judge them. So I'll give you the perfect story. Mystic River, they finished it, and Clint Eastwood had me out to L.A., and I saw it on the Warner Brothers lot with Brian Helgeland, who wrote the script. So we sat in Warner Brothers, and we watched Mystic River. And I came out of the movie theater, and the second I walked out of the movie theater, my cell phone rang, and it was Clint. And he said, what'd you think? And I said, it was amazing. It was incredible. The performance was incredible. The cinematography was astonishing. You really captured Boston, all these other things. He's like, great, great, great. Hang up the phone. I look over. Brian goes, you don't have a clue what you thought. And I was like, I don't. How do you know that? And he's like, because that's the deal. And the deal is, if it's your book that's adapted, it never feels right. It feels artificial. And I learned another thing. I spent a lot of time on the set of Mystic River, and I would never do that again, ever. Because when I'm sitting there and I'm watching the movie, it's bad enough that I can't really fall into it, but I'd be sitting there going, I was sitting right over there. Like when the last shot of the film, the last scene shot in the film is Tim Robbins' interrogation. And I sat beside Clint Eastwood on the floor, and I watched it. It was the final shot. It's one of my favorite Hollywood memories, is sitting beside Clint Eastwood watching the last shot of Mystic River on the set, right? And I thought, this is pretty cool. My life ain't bad. But every time I watched that scene, or I would see that scene, I'd be like, I was right there, and it pulls me out of the scene. So you can't really just judge it. I always, Sean Penn's here right now, and I saw him, and it's an amazing performance he gives as Jimmy Marcus. But it's Sean's Jimmy Marcus. It's not mine. Mine is still in my head, and he's still floating around in there. So it's an alternative universe to see your films. So I can't really judge them for good or for bad. When people will be like, oh, that film didn't really turn out too well, did it? I'm like, I don't know. Or they'll say, that's a masterpiece. And I'll be like, okay. I just can't judge them that way. There was a question in the back. Yes, miss. Why they left? Oh, yeah, poverty. It was poverty. Although my father's story is legendary. Again, these are all these reasons why I'm a storyteller. My father left because they'd already given up the majority of the farm to the oldest brother, and then he took it over. And then the age difference between the oldest brother and my father was like 14 or 15 years. So then my father comes along. Then he's left in the house with him, his brother, his mother, and then that little boy who grew up to be the shit who charged him for a drink, right? And poor Dan, I love Dan, but that's his rep in the family. But anyway, so my grandmother apparently came to the boys one day and she said, "Look, whichever one of you gets married first, you can have the house and take care of me. But the other one of you, you're on your own." My father lost. Denny got married first. And I go back to that farm now, and I say, thank you, God. I'm not built for a farm. I'm barely built for an outdoor cafe. I'm so urban, and I go back and I see my cousin who took that farm, and he's my age. I would have been him. He would have been me. And I go, no. I once saw him wrestle a cow to the ground. He's punching this cow. And let me add, he was insanely hungover. and I was watching him, and I was insanely hungover, and he's beating this cow to get it to the ground so he can brand it. And I'm like, check. Like, I couldn't, so my dad, but my dad tells that story, and the whole village tells the story of walking him to the train station and everybody weeping. And I mean, it's a real, and he came to America, and he spent the rest of his life saying, I can't wait to go back to Ireland. Can't wait. So here's what it all comes down to with immigrants. I said to him at the end, hey, Dad, I was just over there. I'm finally getting successful. What if I bought you a house? You're retired. He said, why the hell would I want to go back there? I think we're done. I got the triple zeros. Thank you.